The silence in your Saxon village carried a different weight, a cold promise clinging to your spine before the pale blue dawn stretched weak fingers over the thatched roofs. The thin mattress beneath you creaked softly as you shifted, its straw stuffing long since compressed by generations of restless nights. Outside, the air was sharp, with the acrid sting of burnt wood lingering from yesterday's meager fire, mingling uneasily with the damp earth and faded scent of moldy straw. You pulled the threadbare wool tunic tighter around your thin frame, its coarse fibers itching relentlessly against your skin, a far cry from any modern comfort you can imagine. If today a no-battery alert sent you into a panic, picture this: watching your last splinter of firewood turn to ash, knowing it might be days or weeks before you could coax a flame again. The chill seeped through brittle walls, while the village stirred slowly to the monotonous rhythm of survival. From the hazy morning mist, the scraping sounds of worn blades against whetstones filtered through the crisp air, accompanied by the steady thud of the grinding stone, turning coarse, uneven grain into dubious flour. Visualize the villagers, silent figures, hunched over fences, repairing broken pails with fingers stiff from yesterday's toil. The fields, stubborn and patchy, refused to yield like before, as if the life was slowly draining from the soil itself. Under the weight of new rule, your breath formed small ghosts, mingling with the lingering smoke as you stepped outside. The world was unchanged in its endless repetition. Fixing, tending, scraping, grinding. The bread baked that morning was dense, heavy with the occasional sawdust or chaff, stretching precious food to quiet more mouths. Somewhere, distant and indifferent, church bells tolled the hours, marking time that felt more like a countdown than a promise. There was a faint glimmer amidst the weariness. Around the communal flicker of a small fire, neighbors shared quiet warmth, a brief haven from cold and hunger. For a moment, in the glow of tired faces, you almost believed the day could hold something better. But as the hours passed, that fragile hope slipped away like smoke from the fire. And then, abruptly, the usual chorus of the village faltered. The dogs' barking ceased mid-yap. A sharp silence fell like a dark cloud, stirring unease. As neighbors' eyes met with a flicker of something unspoken, tension crackling under the surface, waiting to unravel. The Norman presence was no longer a distant shadow, but an oppressive weight, drawing ever closer. Hey, before Morpheus grabs you for good, quickly check if you're still subscribed. For some, the button disappeared, and I don't want you to miss the next bedtime stories. Take a moment and leave a like, soft as a pillow. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Your interaction keeps this little corner of calm alive. Thanks for being part of it. The sudden silence was as if the breath of the village had been withheld. The dog's barks, abruptly cut short, left a hollow canyon of sound that pressed against your eardrums. Your heartbeat matched the quickening pace of your thoughts, each beat a small drum in the fading night. You stood frozen at the threshold of your wattle and daub home, the rough wood of the doorway cold against your palm, as pale light hesitated on the edges of the cloudy sky. A distant clatter broke the stillness, a sharp, metallic ringing far away, echoing faintly like a ghost of war dawning. The nearby woods, usually alive with birdsong and the rustle of small creatures, lay mute, heavy with an unnatural calm. The village held its breath, eyes flickering from shadow to shadow, as if the mist itself had begun to whisper secrets better left unheard. You drew your tunic tighter, the coarse wool scratching your neck, and wrapped your fingers around the haft of your crude wooden spear, leaning by the wall inside. The chill was sharper now, slipping through gaps in the timber and clinging to your bones like a persistent ache that no fire could chase away. Yesterday's weak flame, fed by precious scraps of wood, had died too soon, and the thought of facing a night without flame sent a tremble through your frame. The fields beyond the village flickered in the morning haze, hinting at the barren earth turning stubborn beneath frost-eaten shoots. The Norman yoke pressed harder with every dawn, the men in their dark mail and cold eyes no longer distant figures on the horizon, but close, tightening the noose around your fragile community. You moved slowly toward the center, where the villagers gathered in muted clusters. Faces once marked by weary resignation now bore a sharper edge, unease threaded beneath their weathered skins. They spoke little. Words were weighed and measured like coin, fallible and scarce. From a corner of the square, a thin wisp of smoke curled upward from a hastily assembled fire, its heat barely pushing back the gnawing cold. Your eyes caught the glint of the parish priest's robes as he hurried through the crowd, his lips moving in quiet prayer. Even his voice, usually steady with the arrogance of sacred certainty, carried a tremor. His gaze avoided yours and that of others, retreating as if the approaching threat could swallow faith whole. Suddenly, a low murmur swelled, sharp, uneasy whispers, passing like gossiping shadows between trembling lips. The village serf, a man with hands scarred by toil and a face tangled in tangled stubble, muttered something about the day before, about strange sounds in the forest and the black banners unfurling farther than anyone dared to look. A woman, half covered in a faded mantle, nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting a spark of something older than fear, defiance. Your breath hung out in a white cloud, dissolving slowly, and you squeezed your eyes shut for a moment, trying to steady the swirl of anxiety. This was not just the silence of dawn, or the cold bite of a failing fire. This was the silence before the storm, the moment when the earth seems to hold its breath before spitting out its wrath. A child whimpered from a stall nearby, the sound sharp against the hush, and for a fleeting second, the weight of helplessness pressed down on your chest. The wind shifted, carrying with it the acrid bite of smoke, tinged with something darker, a scent that didn't belong to hearth or forest, something like iron and old wounds. You eyed the horizon once more, where the gray sky met the dark tree line in a jagged scar. There, faint but undeniable, the moving shapes appeared, armored riders shrouded in the shadow of conquest. The flow of your blood quickened. This was the proof you'd feared. No longer mere stories whispered around cold fires, no longer distant rumors folded into the tapestry of hardship. At the village edge, a horn bellowed low and mournful, a sound that reverberated like a dirge across the sleeping earth. It reached into the very marrow, a summons or a warning, you couldn't tell which, before fading into an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow even your ragged breath. You stepped back inside, the wood of your home creaking underfoot, and found the old iron dagger your father had once held. Its dull edge was nicked, but resolute, a small relic of bitter survival in a world grinding steadily to ruin. The firelight flickered weakly across the rough walls, casting shifting shadows that felt like the village's weary ghosts leaning in close. From the murmur of voices outside your window, you caught fragments of plans, whispers of resistance, rumors of an alliance forming beneath the watchful eyes of the enemy. The villagers huddled in secret, and their courage, though bruised and battered, flickered stubbornly like the last embers beneath ash. You knelt beside the cold hearth poker, tracing the worn grooves as if they could offer answers. In that dim, fragile light, the weight settled on you fully. This was no longer survival by mere endurance, but a reckoning. The quiet before the dawn was the prelude. Soon the storm would break, and then, in the farthest corner of the village square, something caught your eye. A figure cloaked in shadows, moving with a purpose that made the very air seem to thicken. Their eyes, sharp and unreadable, locked on you for a heartbeat too long, before fading into the gathering gloom, as if carrying secrets too heavy for words. In that instant, worlds shifted silently and irrevocably. The peace you once knew had splintered, leaving only the fragile hope of resistance and the question that burned beneath your skin. Who truly held the power beneath these pale, cold skies? The figure melted deeper into the shifting dusk, the glow from the village fire casting long shadows that bent and twisted like dark fingers across the uneven cobblestones. You sensed that look again, those sharp eyes like cold steel, not just watching but weighing, hunting for cracks in the tired faces before vanishing into the gathering gloom as silently as they appeared. Your hand tightened around the worn haft of your spear, rough from years of uneven work, and a chill ran deeper than the cold, emberless hearth at your back. The word resistance hung in the haze of murmurs around the square. But what kind of resistance? The kind born of desperation, where hope is rationed with each breath, and betrayal lurks like a rat beneath the floorboards. The village itself seemed to hold its breath. Every creak of settling wood or shift of straw suddenly amplified in the heavy stillness. Smoke from the communal fire curled upwards, a thin ribbon struggling against the chill air, carrying with it the dull ache of burnt wood and the sharper, less forgiving scent of something new. Fear, salted with the taste of impending bloodshed. Behind you, a woman's whispered prayers floated through the cold air. Her voice, thin and fragile, like the wisp of smoke. The parish priest had vanished, swallowed by his own fears. Now, the desperate worship had slipped into furtive incantations, half-words lost in the wind. You remembered the way his voice faltered this morning, trembling beneath the weight of doubt. Faith, once so sure, now felt like a fragile shell, cracked and hollow inside. From a distance, the rumble of hooves finally stirred the morning silence again, low and relentless, like thunder rolling beneath bare feet. The sight no one wished to understand, but everyone feared, came into view. A line of armored riders, cutting through the frost dawn like harbingers of dread. Their black banners, heavy with dripping rain or fresh blood, it was impossible to tell, rippling against the leafless branches of the trees. The villagers scattered, like shadows losing hold on daylight, faces carved with urgency and resigned terror. Children were bundled into trembling mothers' arms, while men exchanged furtive glances, clutching whatever makeshift weapons they could muster. Someone pressed a scarred hand to their mouth, stifling a cry, and a dog elsewhere let loose a warning bark that was swiftly silenced by a harsh hand. You stepped closer to the center of the square, heart pounding in rhythm with the beat of hooves, and caught sight of the serf who had whispered of black banners and strange sounds. His eyes, normally dull from exhaustion, gleamed with fierce defiance now, an ember in the cold ashes of fear. "They come," he muttered, voice rough as gravel, "and not for mercy." There was no hero's welcome to this invading force, no drums of honor, no trumpets blowing glory, just the relentless march of iron and shadow. Settling on the village like a creeping blight, you turned your gaze upward, the sky a smeared canvas of gray and bruised violet, feeling the weight of the cold pressing down with each passing moment. Your breath clouded the air, mingling with smoke and dread, while memories flickered, faint as hiding sparks, of hearths lit by laughter and fields ready to give birth to grain. Now those warm images felt like ghosts themselves, haunting the edges of a world about to be rewritten in ash. The old iron dagger, heavy and dull in your hand, suddenly felt like more than a relic. It was a link to fathers who fought, survived, and passed down the stubborn will to endure. But this was a different fight, silent, grim, and uncertain. There would be no grand strategy, just small acts of defiance against the dark tide. From the side, a soft footfall caught your attention. One of the village children, eyes wide but steady, carrying a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth. A gift, a message, or a warning? The child looked at you with a mix of trust and something you couldn't name. A flicker of hope caught between the tightening jaws of fear. The murmurs around the square grew, a collective intake of breath held tight by countless souls facing the same fate. The fire's glow shrank as the shadow of the riders crept closer, swallowing the comforting warmth, daring the villagers to stand or flee. And then, in the hush where even the wind dared not speak, the iron-shod horses halted at the village's edge, their riders dismounting with purpose, the clink of metal a harsh song against soft earth. The leader stepped forward, cloak dark against the dull light, revealing a face set in grim resolve beneath a helmet dented by countless battles. His eyes swept the crowd, cold, unreadable, and landed squarely on you. Time seemed to slow, the silent exchange breaking something unseen, yet binding in its gravity. This was no mere invader or plundering soldier. This was a reckoning made flesh. The storm that had waited at the edges of your world, now standing before you. You swallowed the lump in your throat, the dagger heavy in your palm, as the frozen moment stretched. Then, from deep within the shadowed figure, a voice, low, steady, impossible to ignore, cut through the thick air. The time has come to choose. The words hung between you, a brittle promise and a threat, folded into one. Around you, the villagers stilled, eyes flickering with a fragile blend of terror and a wild, desperate spark, the same spark you felt burning faintly beneath the weight of cold and smoke. The dawn's pale fingers reached up once more, but the sky had darkened beneath their touch. The world had shifted silently, a door closing on the fragile world you once knew. Now only the choice remained, echoing in the cold stillness that pressed against your skin like a second shadow. The leader's eyes held you captive, sharp and unyielding beneath the dented helmet. Time stretched fragile, the crowd's breath caught in a suspended moment, thick with unspoken threats and futures hanging by a thread. A ragged chill crept along your spine, deeper than the cold ever had, a warning whispered in every bone. Without a word, the rider's gaze flicked toward the encroaching edges of the village. The black banners snap-crackled in the blowing wind, like the last gasp of dying shadows. Their fabric splattered with rain or blood. You couldn't tell which, and it hardly mattered anymore. The horses shifted, iron hooves biting into soft earth as if savoring the weight of what was to come. Behind you, the murmurs of the village pirouetted between fear and defiance. A mother's whispered pleas tangled with the rattle of loose straw under hasty footsteps. Children clutched each other, eyes wide, waiting for the storm to break. Yet somewhere between despair and stubborn hope, your hand gripped tighter the worn shaft of your spear, rough, splintered, an extension of your own will to survive. The campfire's thin flames flickered helplessly against the cold breath of dawn. You swore you caught the scent of damp iron in the air, mingling with frost-bitten earth and cold smoke. It teased memories you thought locked away, hearthside voices swelling with life, broken only by laughter. Those days were ghosts now, shadows trapped behind cracked walls. A soft clatter shifted your attention, a figure stepping from the crowd's edge. The hooded woman, her mantle frayed and muddied, approached with quiet determination. Her eyes met yours, fierce beneath exhaustion, carrying a weight heavier than the morning's gray sky. She held out a folded parchment, edges curled and stained, as if the ragged thing carried all the village's trembling hopes and dark secrets. You unfolded it carefully, fingers numb but steady, ink smeared in places, barely legible, but the message pierced clearly. Plans, maps sketched with trembling hands, routes for those brave enough to slip beyond the watchful eyes of the Norman riders. Words scrawled in urgency, alliances whispered between villages, weapons hidden in forgotten barns, quiet prayers to unseen gods. Resistance, yes, but born more from necessity than heroism. She spoke, voice low, a whisper threading the tense air. They're stronger than we thought, not just raiders, organized, relentless. We don't have long. Her gaze swept the weary faces around. But together, maybe. Her words trailed, swallowed by the hungry wind. Your heart, hammered beneath threadbare tunic. This wasn't a fairy tale battle with shiny knights and clear victories. It was grim, ugly, and endless, like the slow decay of the brittle straw mattress under you. Yet beneath that weight of inevitability, a flicker dared, a fragile spark stoked by whispered promises and defiant eyes. A rough voice interrupted, a grizzled man, scarred hands clutching a battered wooden club. Enough talk. We fight or we fall. His words cut through the cold quiet like a blade through thin fabric. The villagers exchanged glances, some nodded, others swallowed hard, the ghost of fear lingering in their eyes. You felt the old iron dagger press heavy in your palm. Not just a tool for survival, but a symbol, a tether to your father's stubborn will. They'd faced darkness before in countless forms, plague, famine, war, and still stood. Could you? The rider leader finally spoke, a voice low and cutting, slicing through the tense silence. You have a choice, he said, eyes boring into yours again. Submission or chaos. The words tasted bitter, but held a strange clarity. The horizon waited, vast and waiting, as if the whole world held its breath for the answer. A sudden gust whipped through the square, carrying with it a swirl of ash and cold dust. The black banners flared briefly against the dim light, snapping like final warnings. Somewhere beyond the village border, a sudden crack, the sharp report of a bowstring. Or was it just wind? Your gaze darted, catching movement, a shadow slipping silently between timber-framed houses, unseen but not unnoticed. A whispered name floated through your mind, carried by an unseen breath, a secret folded inside the smoke and cold. Then came a sound, faint but discordant, a single, deliberate knock. Not the desperate pounding of a frightened soul, but measured, unyielding, from somewhere deep within the village's trembling heart, calling out, demanding to be answered. You hesitated, the weight of the dagger grounding your thoughts. Each breath fogged the cold air, merging with smoke and silence. Around you, the village held its collective breath, waiting, caught on the razor's edge between survival and surrender. The rider leader's gaze shifted, ever watchful, yet unable to pin down the ripple passing through the crowd. The choice hung between you, sharp as a blade waiting to fall. And then, as if the very night had eyes, you saw it, the faint glint beneath the cloak of the figure who'd vanished into the dusk before. That same piercing stare, still burning with unreadable purpose. Their shadow coiled just beyond the firelight, moving closer, closer. The world seemed to narrow, each heartbeats sinking in quiet terror and unspoken resolve. Behind the looming menace of armor and steel, beneath the heavy cloak of black banners, and beyond the fraying hope of a battered village, a question lingered, unanswered but urgent. Who would be the first to break the silence? The village square lay under a dim shroud, the early light hesitant, as if unsure whether to push past the gray cloud spread like a low fog. Wooden houses leaned wearily against their own age, the brittle scent of cold earth, mingling with faint smoke that curled from reluctant hearths. Your breath rose in pale ribbons, a fragile display vanishing before the air itself seemed to stiffen with tension. The figure in the dark cloak had vanished into the gathering shadows like a whisper swallowed by the night. But their gaze, sharp, unyielding, still burned behind your eyelids. It felt as if those eyes weighed more than stone, threading an unseen tether between you and the secrets hidden beneath the village's fraying calm. You gripped your spear tighter, fingers rough and numb, its wooden shaft splintered but steady. Around you, hushed voices swirled, whispers barely above the rustle of frost-laden straw. Every word carried the weight of a future's unopened, tempered by desperate hope and the raw edge of fear. The rider leader's presence had left a mark deeper than a wound. His words, heavy and cruelly deliberate, echoed in the hollow silence. You have a choice, not simply an offer, but a blade hanging on fragile justice, slicing the village's fragile unity into shards of doubt and determination. Eyes darted among the villagers, searching for signs. Hope in the bowed backs of women, carrying children. Defiance in the stooped shoulders of old men, clutching wooden clubs, scuffed by years of neglect. The thin wisp of smoke from the communal fire stuttered as the cold wind teased it, threatening to snuff out the last warmth shared between neighbors who spoke little but understood everything. The hooded woman approached again, her mantle heavier with damp and dirt from hurried movement. She pressed a folded parchment into your hands, a fragile thread connecting whispered promises and quiet rebellion. The ink was blurred, the edges worn, but the content was clear. The village was no longer isolated. Alliances stirred beyond the tree line. Fragile plans etched in trembling hands. There was strength in unity, a flickering ember beneath the dark tide. Your gaze lifted toward the horizon, where the line of armored riders settled like a shadow creeping across the land. Their black banners snapped sharply, rain or blood smeared upon the fabric, indistinguishable in the dim cold. The horses shifted restlessly, their iron hooves biting soft earth, as if tasting the scattered hopes that clung desperately to the brittle village life. A soft murmur rose, fragile and fraught with tension. Children clung tighter to mothers' skirts, their wide eyes reflecting the dancing firelight. Tiny flames of innocence guarding against the encroaching darkness. An old man spat quietly into the dirt, bitter as the chill wind that rattled loose shingles overhead. The word resistance hung unspoken, yet unanimous, a fragile banner raised beneath the heavy burden. Somewhere in the gathering gloom, a solitary owl's call broke the silence, sudden and haunting, a lament for peace lost, for lives tangled in a web spun far beyond the village's cracked walls. You closed your eyes for a heartbeat, recalling laughter by firelight, the irrepressible hope that once filled these fields, now strewn with frost-bitten stalks. The iron dagger in your palm felt heavier than ever, cold metal, biting into skin, worn thin by toil and worry. It was more than a tool now. It was a symbol forged by fathers who faced storms before, their silent courage coursing through your veins, a reminder that surrender was the easy path, but not the one your heart would follow. Your ears caught the faintest sound, the soft padding of bare feet on frozen ground. Turning slowly, you met the child's gaze once more, the messenger of whispered hope wrapped in a bundle of rough cloth. Trust and fear flickered behind wide eyes. The fragile balance between innocence and the cruel necessity of survival. From the shadows, other figures emerged, quiet, resolute, bearing their own weapons cobbled from desperation. Worn clubs, rusted knives, shapes carved by hardship and refined by resolve. The village was awakening, a fractured heart beating beneath the weight of a rising storm. The horses' hooves tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the pounding of your chest. The riders dismounted with the cold precision of inevitability, armor clinking like a grim reminder of unforgiving fate. The leader stepped forward again, the dim light catching the scars etched across his weathered face beneath the dented helmet. His gaze found yours once more, unchanging, relentless. "The time to choose is now," he said, voice low and insistent, the same words twisted with fresh menace. Around you, the villagers braced against dread, some stepping closer, others faltering. The moment thickened, a fragile breath held at the apex of an unseen cliff before the fall. And then a sudden crack, sharp as broken bones, in the silence, not from the riders, but somewhere close. A shadow detached itself from the darkness near an abandoned smithy, moving with deliberate silence, carrying a secret too urgent for daylight. The cloak shivered in the cold breeze, a subtle flash of steel catching the firelight. A signal or a challenge before dissolving into the mist. Your heartbeat thundered, words tumbling in your mind. But the question that gripped you carried no answer. Who among us will be the first to break the silence? The chill deepened as the shadow dissolved into the mist, swallowing the flickering firelight and leaving the village square under a blanket of uneasy quiet. You tightened your grip on the spear, fingers rough against splintered wood, the cold seeping through your threadbare tunic like a slow, creeping doubt. The horse's hooves, once a distant murmur, now settled into a near heartbeat, relentless, steady, a rhythm that matched the pounding in your chest. Around you, faces pressed closer in the dim glow, eyes wide yet narrowed with stubborn will. The woman who delivered the parchment vanished as quickly as she'd appeared, leaving behind a fragile promise inked on crumpled paper, plans whispered in fear, clothed in shadows and hope. A spark dared to ignite in the chapped hands of the villagers, the brittle promise of resistance. Your breath hovered between your lips, a white thread dissolving into the biting air. You could almost taste smoke tangled with frost, a scent that spoke of burnt timber and old wounds not yet healed. Behind the murmur of whispered words, the village exhaled with a tension tight enough to fracture the roughened earth beneath your feet. The rider leader's voice had carved a choice into the thin morning air, submission or chaos. Yet the weight settled unevenly across your shoulders. There was no easy path here. The cold steel pressing at your ribs demanded a decision, but the mind wrestled with shadows heavier than armor. Trust or betrayal, courage or self-preservation, action or waiting. A soft scrape caught your ear, a child stepping lightly through the gathering near the smithy. The small figure stopped beside you, eyes wide pools of unwavering trust, clutching a rough bundle in dirt-stained hands. You took it cautiously. Inside was a simple token, a twisted piece of iron, shaped in secret, hardened by whispered forges. A reminder that even the smallest flame could flare fiercely when stoked with enough will. Behind the shields of the warriors at the village's edge, the trees held their breath too, branches clawing the sky like desperate hands. Somewhere, a single crow cawed long and mournful. The echo settled like a dirge, a lament for the fading peace long stolen by iron and shadow. The village's heartbeat quickened, an uneven cadence, straining against the heavy cloak of fear. Wood groaned under frost. Loose straw shifted as villagers exchanged hurried looks, some steeling themselves, others already retreating into minds fogged with dread. You stepped forward into the faint clearing between the houses, where the fire's glow fell cold and sputtering. The faces around you blurred, shadows merging with smoke, and memories of laughter lost to colder days. A shared glance passed, like an unspoken vow. The fight couldn't wait for heroes to arrive. It lived in the worn hands, the difficult breaths, the flames that refused to die. Suddenly, the distant sound of hooves broke again, louder this time, raking the frost-hardened ground with a relentless urgency. The black banners rippled once more, their wet cloth slapping in the wind like the wings of some great, vengeful bird. The riders poured into the pale light, armor reflecting the faltering dawn in dull, threatening glints. Your eyes locked onto the leader again. The helmet's dented steel traced lines like scars from battles won and lost. His gaze was unyielding, layered with a terrible patience, the kind cultivated by those who've known victory and mercy only in stories. Shadows flickered behind his eyes, and for a breath, it felt like he looked right through the village's fragile hope. He took a slow step forward, the weight of his sword resting comfortably in his hand. Around him, silence stretched taut, so brittle it threatened to shatter with the slightest noise. Then his voice spilled out, calm but edged with the promise of finality. Time's turned to ash. One choice, and it will burn what remains. The villagers stiffened, shoulders hunched but unbroken. Some clutched weapons cobbled together in desperation, old knives dulled by years of use, rusted farm tools pressed into service. Others drew their children closer, eyes flickering between terror and the faintest glimmers of defiance. A whistle sliced through the still air, sharp and deliberate. Heads snapped toward the broken archway at the village's edge, where the shadows pooled thickest. From that dark fold stepped a figure, cloaked, silent, moving with a purpose that pressed weight into the moment. The faintest glint of steel caught the dying firelight, a whisper of rebellion in a sea of waiting dread. The figure's eyes found yours once again, unflinching, fierce, a challenge wrapped in shadows. The village seemed to lean in, breath caught, the fragile thread of hope stretching tight against the cold. You swallowed against the sudden lump in your throat, the old dagger heavy in your palm, suddenly feeling like the last flicker of warmth in a frozen world. This was the tipping point, not just for you, but for every fading ember of this fragile settlement. And then the world held its breath, waiting for the silence to break. Who would be the first to shatter it? The night's cold grip lingered, a breathless weight pressing down as shadows thickened under the waning light. Your fingers curled tighter around the spear's rough wood, the skin peeled and raw where splinters had long made their home. The village square, once a place of dull routine, now pulsed with an unspoken urgency, like a bird before sudden flight. Faces blur and sharpened all at once, etched by fear, but flickering with defiant embers. Smoke from the dying fire curled upwards, a fragile veil clinging to the chill air. The scent was familiar, burnt wood mixing with damp straw, but beneath it you caught a sharper undertone. Sweat, iron, and something darker, like promises made in whispered blood. A firelight cast uneven shadows, dancing against cracked walls and tired eyes. Holding fast to the last shreds of warmth the village could claim. Close by, a group gathered in tense silence, their voices reduced to breathy murmurs. The old man, with hands like gnarled roots, gripped a crooked club, his jaw tight as stone. A woman, wrapped in threadbare cloth, clutched a child, her eyes darting nervously toward the edge of the square where horses had fallen still, their breath rippling in frosty puffs. The horses seemed almost statuesque in the gloom, shadows among shadows, waiting. The rider-leader stood apart, a rigid silhouette against the dim glow, the dented helmet glinting faintly like a captive star. His gaze tracked the crowd relentlessly, sharp and unreadable, a cold temperature that seemed to lower the air by degrees. When his voice came, low and gravel-thick, it sliced through the tight-knit silence like a blade. "The hour has tightened its grip," he said, words heavy with inevitability. "The choice remains clear: submission and survival, or defiance and ruin." Around you, the crowd shifted. Some swallowed hard, others tightened their fists. The old man's club struck the earth once, twice, tapping a rhythm of resistance born from countless, hard-fought mornings like this. But even courage, raw and jagged, trembled under the looming shadow of steel and mail. A sudden breeze stirred the embers, sending sparks like fleeting fireflies into the dark. The woman's whispered prayers rose faintly above the murmur, a fragile thread weaving hope beneath tension's chokehold. For a breath, the cold seemed to fade, replaced by a fragile pulse, neighbor to neighbor, the warmth of shared secrets and quiet promises. Yet beyond this flicker, the horizon held only threat. The black banner shuddered once more in the wind, wet and heavy with the burdens of countless battles. The riders' steely beasts pawed at frozen earth, stamping out the last traces of peace like a slow, methodical reckoning. Your gaze strayed beyond the square to a narrow alley cloaked in shadow, where the cloak from before moved once more, a faint ripple in the dark fabric, a flicker of steel catching the dying firelight. The figure was but a whisper, but their presence carried weight, threading the air with tension that prickled along your spine. As they glided between timbered houses, the village held its breath. Again, this was no stranger, but a living question mark, an unreadable cipher that spoke of dangers unseen and alliances yet to be forged. Their eyes met yours briefly, sharp, silent, unyielding, then vanished softly into night's embrace. The sound of hooves echoed anew, harder, a relentless driveline, breaking the dawn's fragile calm. The riders reassembled at the village's mouth, a wall of iron and shadow, unmoving, yet poised to strike. Their arrival was the approaching storm's rumble before the silence shatters, every heartbeat syncing with the hooves' grim cadence. A child's cry broke through the tension, quick and sharp, a fragile note in the heavy symphony of dread. Mothers hushed their young, men steeled themselves, and the village's collective resolve solidified into the shape of fragile defiance. The rider leader stepped forward once more, his sword's dull scabbard scraping the frost-hardened ground. His voice carried a weight forged in merciless winters and bloodied summers. Decide now. Stand beneath the yoke and live. Resist and become ghosts under this sky. That last word hung in the air with the weight of a tombstone. Your fingers brushed over the cold iron of the dagger at your waist. A legacy from fathers whose bones fed the earth you stood on. This was not their war, but their courage lived in you, raw and aching. From the corner of your eye, shadowed movement drew your attention. Another figure, slipping through night's folds. A soft footfall, deliberate and unhurried. They carried nothing but silence and intent. The faint gleam of something hidden, whispered secrets. Only the brave dared hope to decode. A hush settled, thicker than any cold, as eyes locked across the square. The village seemed to pulse with a fragile heartbeat, trembling on the edge of collapse and something startlingly new. A choice that could change everything. The rider leader's silhouette trembled in the faint firelight, then straightened, a statue unwilling to bend. You will decide who among you breaks the silence, he said, voice almost a shadow itself. And then the shadow shifted again, stepping from the dark to the fire's edge. The air trembled, the fragile pieces of fear and hope poised to fall apart or align. Your breath caught, muscles coiled, heart drumming a relentless warbeat. The old dagger felt heavier now, a weight tethered to every story, ever told beneath these quiet skies. The night waited, unblinking. Who would shatter this silence first? The night thickened, like a dark woolen cloak, thrown heavy across the village. Your breath hung frozen in the air, a faint ghost, dissolving before it could find warmth. The fire sputtered, its thin fingers of flame clawing briefly at the cold wind before retreating. Around you, the villagers huddled close, limbs wrapped in threadbare cloth, and faces etched with lines sharper than the frost outside. The silence between heartbeats grew heavier, not empty, but dense with unspoken fear. The cloaked figure had vanished into the shadows, swallowed by the night, like a secret never meant to be shared. Yet the memory of those piercing eyes lingered. They burned behind your eyelids every time you blinked, holding steady even as the rest of the world faded into cold gray. Your hand wrapped tighter around the spear's rough shaft. The splinters dug into your palm, a sharp reminder that this piece of wood carried more weight than its humble form suggested. A totem of fragile hope, stubborn survival. The village square seemed smaller now, constricted by the pressing darkness and the invisible web of tension that drew tight with every breath. Low murmurs wove through the crowd like cold currents slipping beneath frozen ground. Some words were caught in the air, fragile and broken. Alliances, plans, resistance. You caught fragments, murmurs of other villages, secret meetings behind hedgerows, weapons hidden beneath rotting floorboards. The world beyond your village trembled with whispers of rebellion. But here, beneath the shuddering black banners and frost-bitten roofs, it still felt like holding your breath underwater, waiting to break the surface, or perhaps to be pulled under. The rider leader stood apart, a monolith shadowed by the dim firelight. His battered helmet gleamed faintly. Scars on the steel spoke of battles waged long before this dawn. His voice, when it came, cut the cold like a blade glistening with wetness, sharp but smoothed by years of command. Choice lies before you, he said, each word dropping heavy as frost on bare skin. Yield, and peace can settle once more, such peace as we grant to those who bend. Resist, and the earth will learn to forget your bones. Mothers clutched children closer, eyes wide pools of terror and defiance. Men shifted, some drawing breath to speak, but swallowing it back down like bitter pills. The quiet was thick enough to swallow a scream whole. You felt the weight of 1,000 past defeats nesting in your chest, a slow burning wound forged in silence and fear. A sudden breeze stirred the extinguished embers, sending a cigarette-thin wisp of smoke, curling and folding against the night sky. The scent mixed strangely with cold earth and damp wood. But underneath, something sharper, metallic, the breath of iron and old wounds reopening. Your fingers brushed against the cold metal of the dagger at your waist, its dull edge a bitter reminder of survival passed down in shadows. A soft footfall drew your gaze. A child emerged from the gloom, eyes luminous with a kind of quiet determination that felt almost out of place. In their trembling hands, they held a wrapped bundle, rough cloth, stained and threadbare. The child's gaze met yours, steady and unflinching, a fragile promise woven into their small frame. You untied the bundle with careful hands, your fingers stiff with cold and resolve. Inside lay tools forged in whispered fires, crude weapons, knives harder than fear itself, and a small parchment. The ink was faded, smudged by rain or perhaps endless handling, but the lines told a story. Plans meant to fracture the shadow pressing down on your village, roots etched in secrecy, quiet coordination of those who dared still to dream of resistance. Around the fire, villagers stiffened, eyes wide, faces pale, but burning with something hidden beneath, a flicker of the old fire, stubborn and fierce. The word hung in the chilled air, barely breathed aloud. Resistance. Desperate, painful, but real. From the dark edge of the timbered houses, the black banners loomed larger, snapping crisply, as if exhausted souls shook the fabric free from the weight of sorrow. Horses pawed the frozen earth, hooves grinding the brittle ground in rhythms as relentless as the pounding of your own heart. The rider-leader moved forward, his armor scraping softly against rough wood and cold stone. His gaze found yours once more, harsh, assessing, unreadable. "Last chance," he said, voice low but echoing with the weight of inevitable winter. "Yield and live in shadow. Resist and become whispers in dust." The crowd stirred, breaths caught in rising tension. Some stepped closer, faces weathered but unbroken. Others faltered, swallowed by the gathering storm of doubt. Around them, shadows deepened as night edged inward, swallowing the fragile glow of flame. Then, from the far corner of the square, a figure stepped silently into the firelight, the cloak pulled tight, eyes sharp as broken glass. Their hand glinted with steel, not the cold, imposing metal of your enemies, but something smaller, sharper, honed in quiet desperation. The village's breath collectively held, their gaze locked with yours again, fierce and unwavering, a silent call to arms beneath the weight of night. The air itself seemed to suspend, stretched thin between fear and the faintest pulse of hope. The choice was no longer distant. It pressed close, a knife's edge, a whispered question hanging heavy as frost. Who among you will break the silence first? The cold held its breath as the first light stretched tentatively across the village, softening the silhouette of thatched roofs and pale timber frames worn by years of wind and worry. The frost clung stubbornly to the earth, sparkling faintly like scattered diamonds upon the brittle grass and hardened soil. the same ground that would soon bear the traces of choice, courage, and consequence. You stood in the dim center of the square, spear resting lightly in your grasp, though your fingers remained stiff with cold. That all flames must fade, even those fueled by desperation and hope. Around you, the village began to stir, not with reckless noise, but with the careful calm born of a long night's reckoning. Faces, once tight with terror and doubt, now softened, touched by something dynamic yet fragile. A collective breath released after holding on for too long. The black banners had fallen back, ragged and torn, their dark threat receding with the slow rise of day. The riders had ridden on, drawn away by forces beyond this small settlement, leaving behind a fragile peace weighed down by cost and vigilance. Your gaze drifted to the once menacing horizon, now a pale wash of morning mist, where sharp spikes of dawn light pierced through fragile clouds. The sharp clang of armor and the thunder of hooves had given way to quiet footsteps, whispers of survival, and the rustling of worn fabric in the gentle wind. The hooded woman from before stood nearby, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but brightened by relief. In one hand, she still held the crumpled parchment, the same delicate map of secret roads and whispered alliances that had kindled a flame amid despair. For a moment, you allowed yourself to imagine that perhaps those plans would seed something lasting. A network of solidarity beyond the fields embroidered with frost, and the fences mended in silence. Children peeked cautiously from behind mothers' skirts, their small hands clutching makeshift talismans or tiny tools, symbols of the future they could not yet fully grasp, but instinctively guarded. The old man's club, scarred by years of use, rested quietly against a wall as he exchanged a tired but steady nod with his neighbors. The village was bruised and battered, but it had breathed through the storm. In your hand, the old dagger felt lighter now, its cold iron comfortingly familiar. No longer just a tool of survival or defiance, it had become a silent witness to the life that persisted beneath heavy shadows. You pressed it against your chest, as if grounding yourself in the strength handed down through generations. Fathers, mothers, and children who had faced winter's bite and the harshness of fate with stubborn resilience. The wattle and daub walls around you, smelling faintly of smoke, earth, and sweat, held echoes of 1,000 stories, moments of laughter by firelight, fleeting tenderness in the harshest of times, the unspoken bonds that had never been scribed but lived in glances and shared toil. Those walls had endured, and so would you. A soft wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of rain yet to fall, mingling with the distant song of birds returning cautiously to the frozen wood. The village's breath settled into a slow, steady rhythm, a quiet pulse beneath the fading tension. Your eyes caught the figure of the shadowed stranger one last time, emerging from the edges of the and rested from the grip of ruin. The silence now was different, not the heavy hush before destruction, but a soft, welcoming stillness that cradled the village like a well-worn cloak. It held the weight of remembrance and the lightness of a future yet unwritten. The storm had passed, leaving behind the raw earth of healing and the cautious stirrings of hope. You moved toward the threshold of your home, the worn wooden frame cool beneath your palm, but steady as ever. The thin mattress welcomed you, familiar and comforting in its humble way. As you settled down, the coarse fibers of your wool tunic now felt less like a burden and more like armor shaped by endurance. Outside, the day stretched quietly onward, fields waiting patiently for seed, neighbors exchanging tentative smiles, and the softened murmur of life reclaiming its place among ashes and frost. The church bells tolled once again, their sound no longer a countdown, but a gentle marking of time's slow, steady passage. You closed your eyes, the lingering sense of burnt wood and damp earth mingling with the calm that seeped into your bones. The village, fragile yet unbroken, breathed around you, the stories etched into its stones and people had found a point of rest for now. And as the pale blue dawn deepened into morning's soft glow, a quiet peace settled over the village, wrapping the landscape in a calm embrace. The silence was no longer a threat, but a promise fulfilled. Sleep came easy, like a gentle tide pulling you into its fold.